I first just want to say I'm thrilled to be joining another AP roundtable, and I'm looking forward to discussing part 2, where everything is communication, and as Katie mentioned, really diving into AAC. So I'm going to share my presentation real fast. All right. So before we first start in, I'd love to hear from all of you and just see who is here at the roundtable. In the chat, could you please share your relationship to your AP hero, if you're a caregiver, a family member, a parent, an educator, therapist? Great. So I'm seeing a lot of moms and parents. Wonderful. Perfect. So yeah, as Katie mentioned, this will be recorded. So please feel free to share this with the rest of the team or however you see fit of how this could help. Excellent. All right. And so also, since this is about AAC, I'd love to hear from you all too on your AP heroes and if they use an AAC system. If so, if you feel comfortable sharing kind of what that looks like or what system they use, if they're not currently using one, or if you're looking at starting an assessment, just kind of where you are at in the process. Great. So I see AAC with touch chat, another one with touch chat. Currently not using one. We'll have one, and it's been a challenge. So I'm really hoping at the end we'll have enough time to brainstorm together and kind of talk about what challenges might arise with an AAC system. And this is great too, also that we have some people who currently aren't using one, so we can discuss too of what it looks like and who might be good candidates for AAC systems, what the AAC assessment process looks like. And I see another one saying that we have one, but it's been a challenge. So I'm really hoping that at the end we can talk more about some of these challenges that might have come up, and hopefully throughout this can help answer some questions you might have. So we're first going to start by defining AAC because it's a pretty general term. It's just a little side note. We could spend days and days talking about AAC. So I'm going to hit some very general highlights as we go through this. And then if you do have any questions as I'm going through, please feel free to unmute yourself or throw into the chat any questions you have. And we can definitely pause and talk more about that. So after defining AAC, we're going to talk about the AAC process, assessment process. We'll then spend the bulk of the time talking about modeling and prompting. And then we'll go into stimming in AAC and ending with any questions and answers. And a lot of this will also be based on what we discussed previously with the first Everything is Communication roundtable. So it'll just kind of be building off of that as well. So to start, AAC stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication. And augmentative really means to supplement or augment a natural speech or spoken speech. Versus alternative would be an alternative means instead of using spoken speech. I think often there tends to be this idea that AAC is just primarily used as alternative communication. But more often than not, I see it as being more augmentative. So we still have those other modalities as well. It's just in addition to. And then as we know, communication is that active process of exchanging information and ideas. So there are a bunch of different types of AAC. This can range all the way from light tech AAC systems, which would be maybe more of those printed out versions, like you might see a core board that's printed out and it has all these words on there. There's no speech output. It's just a printed version of it. Then we might have something like a mid-tech device, and that's going to be where you press a single button and there will be a voice output. It's often like a pre-recorded phrase or word. And usually it's fewer amount of buttons on there. It's also very static, so it doesn't change. It's just is always the same word on there unless you record as something else. Versus a high-tech system would be where we have a dynamic display where it does have that voice output. So you're going to hear that word being spoken, but it also can move or change. So you might have different folders. So you might go into like the folder toys, and that's going to open up to toys. So as we're going through this, I want you to be thinking about these all together, because more often than not, we'll see a mixture of them too, especially for, AP heroes or individuals who might have more complex communication needs, where we'll have a high-tech device, but then we also might have a light tech where it's a printed out page of the home page. So just kind of keeping in mind that it could really look a bunch of different ways. And I know also a lot of you mentioned too that you're using touch chat, which would be one of those high-tech devices. So then thinking about who might need AAC, and this can be really helpful for anybody who might be considering AAC or wondering if their child might be a candidate for AAC. AAC is great for anybody whose communication needs cannot be met through their existing speech. And so this could look like any kind of unintelligible speech. So it might not be intelligible for familiar or unfamiliar listeners. They might have inconsistent speech or even no speech. So kind of going back to that alternative means in the AAC. But you also might see more language-based challenges. So like they might have a limited vocabulary or receptive language difficulties. We also might see reduced use of various communicative functions. So maybe they're stuck in that just requesting mode where everything is I want, or they're just requesting, but we're not seeing as much of asking questions or telling jokes or making comments. So that could also be a really good use for AAC. And then another one too that I hear a lot from different podcasters I've listened to who are AAC users and advocates too, is they might use AAC when their speech feels inaccessible. And this could be due to different internal stressors. So maybe in environments where it's particularly more stressful, like giving a presentation or like ordering food or different things like that in a new social context, AAC might be a really good alternative means to then communicate. Or if internally they're in pain and they're having difficulty accessing their spoken speech, that can also be a really helpful tool. And also just to share too, I do have a resource at the end that's a really nice checklist that I'll pass on or share into the link, and you can go through that, and that'll kind of break down all the different purposes behind AAC and how that can help determine candidacy with one. So another thing that often comes up when I work with parents and caregivers and teams with AAC is there are some misconceptions that come along with it. The first one is, and probably one of the biggest concerns, is that AAC will prevent the individual from ever learning to talk or to use their spoken speech. When in reality, there have been numerous studies out there that have shown that AAC does not hinder speech development. In fact, a lot of these high quality studies show that it can have positive effects on speech and language development. And when I think about that personally and start to kind of break that down, even focusing on language, when we have AAC, we have a visual tool that we can use. So we have our symbols and we have written text, and that visual is going to help with that language retrieval or that word retrieval. So we're already reducing that linguistic and cognitive load that they're carrying, and now they can more easily access that language. And when they can more easily access the language, then they also might be able to access speech because they can start to reallocate that, that cognition or that cognitive need or linguistic need. And also another bonus too is, especially thinking of high-tech devices, you have a consistent output that is happening every time. And so then they can hear that consistent output, and that can also help promote their speech. But again, these are more my interpretations within that. Another misconception is that AAC is a last resort. So in reality, anytime, as we spoke about before, if you see your 8P hero ever having difficulty with any of those previously listed challenges, then definitely would benefit from trying out AAC. We don't want to wait till the very end because we want early introduction of AAC to help those communication skills. And the sooner we're able to help those communication skills and build that confidence, then the less likely there is to be feelings of negativity associated with communication or anxiety around that. Another one too is that a person must have the prerequisite skill to use AAC. So I've heard from many other team members before of saying that I just don't feel like they're ready for AAC yet. But in reality, there really are no prerequisite skills. If we even think about, you know, the one-on-one correspondence of cause and effect of if something happens, then this happens. If they're not really necessarily demonstrating that as a strength yet, we can still implement AAC and start to teach that together. So it can grow with the individual. Same with, say, like joint attention, where even if they're not showing joint attention in different ways, we can use the AAC and start to model and expose them on how that can look, and then it can continue to grow with them. So I'm going to pause right there. So that's just a brief introduction to AAC, but does anyone have any questions related to that before we dive into assessment?
We're a small group, so please feel free to just unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Katie. Cool. Well, if anything pops into anybody's mind, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. So now we're going to talk about assessment. Again, this can be very in-depth. So as always, I highly recommend seeking out your speech therapist, and the team, which we'll talk about too, because there are so many different facets within this. But I do want to highlight some things that frequently come up with the teams I work with, because I feel it's important for you all to have the knowledge to then better advocate for your AP heroes. So first and foremost, this is a team-based approach. And so what I mean by that is we have many team members, and it starts with our communicator. We have parents, caregivers, and families, the speech therapist, OT, PT, educators, audiologists, vision specialists, and I'm sure so many more like neurologists, child psychologists. But for the sake of who I usually work with, I included this little circle right here of team members. So in this, our foundation, of course, and our whole purpose is around the communicator or our potential AAC user. So when we're thinking about the assessment, we really want to lean on them and what they're communicating to us. And remember, this doesn't have to be with spoken speech. This doesn't have to be with already maybe an AAC if you're reevaluating for a different one. It could also be through nonverbal communication. So this is where we're looking at how do they share information about themselves? What about their interests or dislikes? Can we see what they're communicating through that? We also want to look at their routines, because those can be very important on how we want to introduce the AAC system and build off of it. We want to look at important people in their lives. And then we also want to take their input and their preferences and apply that to whatever we're looking at in this AAC assessment process. So for example, I put voice options on here because I had one girl who absolutely loved the voice output of a British little girl. We realized that's because it sounded very much like Peppa Pig. And so there was that association. And that's kind of where we started with the AAC system, because she was so motivated and interested in that. And that's how she was showing us that that was a preference. Similarly with vocabulary, then maybe we also have Peppa Pig in there to start off with. And because we know that's highly motivating when we're starting this assessment process. Their preferred access methods. So often, I guess to back up, so access would be any ability to, or how they interact with the device to select a button. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for example, usually we think of using the pointer index finger, an isolated point to select a button on there. I've also had kids though who prefer to use their thumb or their pinky, and that's how they access it. And that's wonderful and accepted. Then we also want to think about self-advocacy skills. So if there are any repairs or updates that are needed, how they respond to AAC use. So some of the high-tech devices might even have a button that says, please wait while I find my message, and starting to teach those advocacy skills. So just thinking about when we do want to start to trial an AAC system, do we have access to that for them to be able to do? And then most importantly, communication really shapes our identity. It's kind of, or vice versa, communication shows our identity. So really seeing, how is their personality coming through, their humor, their values, does this AAC system help support that? So then all of this is based on the communicator, but sometimes we have difficulty, really dispersing and figuring out additional information from the communicator. So that's where we lean on the parents, caregivers, and family members, because as we've discussed, you guys are the experts of your AP heroes. And so this can be really helpful with informing vocabulary, maybe even sharing different cultural and linguistic considerations. So if the family or family members are bilingual, and we can then maybe look at an AAC application where you can toggle between two different languages. Similarly with family preferences too, different symbols speak more to different families, different advocacy. So also ensuring that they have access to the AAC system at all times and that all team members are using them, and then how to respond to the AAC use when the communicator does use them, and how you can use it too, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And of course, there's a speech therapist, which is more so their role is the knowledge of the AAC. And that's where we're going to go into the AAC assessments, setting it up. Ideally, we have a lot of team member training happening, but I know that can sometimes be tricky to do. So trying to ensure that each of the team members are being trained on how to use the AAC system. Coordinating those team meetings, collecting data. And then of course, there's also just the language assessment, which would be like looking at their vocabulary, their grammar, their syntax, and other communication assessments. Other team members too. Just when I'll go a little bit more quickly through, but we have our OT who often look at fine motor skills. This can be great for access, like I was saying, on how they're going to select different buttons, different grid sizes. And by that, I mean, how many words can there be on a page that the individual can access? Different visual scanning abilities, some sensory considerations, and I can't highlight this enough, where if we're doing an AAC assessment, we want to ensure that the AP hero feels comfortable and regulated and ready to learn and ready to be exposed to something new. And so we want to ensure that, you know, if we're looking at environmental factors, let's have it in whether they prefer a calm setting or a more busy setting, whatever is best for the AP hero. And then for physical therapists, we have mobility with the AAC system. So thinking about the straps, can the individual carry straps if they have more mobility? Do we need a certain stand that will help or a handle to help carry it? If they use a wheelchair, then maybe a mounting system would be more appropriate. And then when they are using it, what does the positioning and seating look like? We want to ensure that they have proper alignment so that they can access all of the words that are on the AAC system and that they feel comfortable. For educators, we often want to look at the literacy skills, so spelling and reading, because we do see text on AAC systems. And we can definitely use that as a strength and build off of that if that's one of the individual's strengths. We want to look at their visual identification and matching, and maybe like symbol representation. So do they understand that the symbol of a fork indicates eat? We can also look at social skills. So how do they perform in a group setting? Their different learning styles, and then behavioral supports. So if you have an ABA team member, then maybe you lean on them to see how can we give them the supports they need to be to have the most effect or the best time using their AAC system. Additional team members could be the audiologist and a vision specialist. So when we start an AAC assessment, we always want to ensure that we have an up-to-date hearing and vision screening or exam. And if there is a presence of any kind of hearing loss, then maybe we're looking at hearing aids and ensuring that those are on the individual, that they're working, or maybe an FM system. We can also play around with different voice output if we have a high-tech or mid-tech device. And then we also could use feedback, so like a visual output of maybe it highlights the word, a vibro-tactile output, so it buzzes so they can feel it when they indicate or press the button. For vision specialists, especially if we're thinking of, you know, potentially a CVI, we might want to use high contrast symbols, maybe enlarge the symbols or the text. Tactile markers can be great too. So thinking of light tech devices, again, kind of like those where they don't have any voice output, you could have a printout or like a 3D symbol of a fork. And then when they feel that, then they know that means eat, and that could be their button. So again, this is kind of putting all of the team together to create that more holistic view of the communicator. And once we get all of this information together, then we can start to dive into feature matching. So feature matching is essentially when we take our AP hero or communicator and we look at them and all of their strengths. So we really want to take that strength-based approach with them and see, okay, how do they learn? How do they communicate? And we'll take all of those and then we're going to match it to the different features of an AAC system and see what's going to be best. So for example, we can look at access to start. And again, this is where we might want to bring in our OTs and PTs, vision specialists, the whole team. And we could look at either direct selection or indirect selection. And direct selection is going to be when they interact directly with the AAC system. And that could be, like we mentioned, that direct point. They might use a stylus to press the button. That could also be eye gaze too, because that would be direct selection with it. Versus indirect selection might be like auditory scanning, where you hear the buttons being read aloud and they press a separate button when they want that button to be activated. So considering that those are two options, and those might then start on which AAC system or AAC language system we're going to go to. Because next thing we have for the AAC language system, we always want to make sure that's a really robust language system. What I mean by that is having a large variety of words and access to them. And those would include those core words, which we discussed last time, and those are going to be those action words, adjectives, some pronouns, and it also should include fringe words, which are going to be like those nouns, and then personal words, which are personal to the individual. So maybe instead of using the word dinner, they might use the word supper. And that would be one that we would want to include on the device when we're doing our assessment. Another really important one too is ensuring that we have a variety of different communicative functions. I've seen some AAC systems where they're very much just set up into that requesting mode of I want, and then it's a bunch of different items. But we also want to ensure that we have all those other communicative functions too that are easily accessible, like asking questions or terminating activities. And then another part of having that robust language system is also having access to alphabet or to an alphabet tool. So a big piece of when we're going into this assessment is trying to have a growth mindset where we're not trying to just match the right now AAC system, because we know our 8P heroes are going to continue to grow, continue to develop, and progress with their communication skills, especially now that they have an AAC system with them. However, we don't want to keep on changing what that looks like, right? So we want to try to pick something that will be beneficial for them a year down the road, 5 years, 10 years, and something that they can continue to grow with. So having the access to an alphabet tool, even if right now they may not, have letter sound correspondence, or they might have very emerging literacy skills, we want to think about what that looks like farther down, because when we have this alphabet, so like right here's an example, this alphabet tool, if they don't have access to a word on there, then they may be able to spell it out later on. Or maybe they start to gravitate towards more spelling instead of using buttons, but we're giving them that option for later down the road. We also want to ensure that we have the ability to support grammar. So similarly thinking of that growth mindset. Maybe right now we're just using that single word of go or eat, but eventually maybe they're going to want to say like she eats or she ate, and starting to change those grammatical markers. Also important is to have the ability to store pre-programmed messages. So this is often where I think of some of those like quick chats that frequently happen. For example, if we see somebody, we say, hi, how are you? To be able to just do how are you very quickly, or something that's meaningful for the individual, then that can be really helpful too with efficiency and communication. And then as I mentioned, we also want to ensure that we can grow with the language over time. So some additional modifications and considerations that we might want to think about when we're doing this AAC assessment is even with device size. For example, you could have a mini iPad, a huge pro of that is just how easy it is to carry around. It's lightweight. Maybe that's a really beneficial device for your 8P hero. And then you also might have a regular size iPad, which although it's bigger, one of the pros with that is now we have the ability to access more buttons on the home screen. So you could have a larger grid size. So instead of maybe 15 buttons on the home page, now you have access to 30 buttons on the home page. So again, just things to consider as you move forward with this. And with that in mind, I guess to kind of dive a little bit more into the grid size considerations, a key thing to keep in mind is to always start with the largest grid size that's attainable for the individual. And why I say this is, again, going back to my favorite term for right now of the growth mindset, we want to start with the largest one, because each time that we increase the grid size, those buttons are going to move. And it's kind of like if you think of, or for example, I'll use my computer and I can type, I can scroll, I can do everything without looking at it, and I have it memorized. But as soon as you were to give me an Apple computer, the scroll button's different, all the buttons are misplaced, and it can be so frustrating to have to relearn. So when we change that grid size, we're changing the buttons and where they're located, which can lead to more frustration and communication breakdown. So what I recommend is starting with that largest grid size. And even if they're not 100% accurate, even if they're, say, 70, 80% accurate with hitting that button, that's where we want to go. Because there's always room for that growth, right? Whether it's motorically or just familiarity with the device. With that said, say you have 60 buttons on a home page, and that can look very overwhelming, especially for somebody that might be a newer AAC user. What we can do is we can start to mask those buttons or hide them. So any buttons that we feel may not be, linguistically most appropriate at this time, then we can hide that. So an example could be the word is. That's a very common core word because it's frequently occurring. However, we don't get as much from it because it's more of a grammatical marker. So we could hide the word is, but we could still have go and eat and all these other words on there. And now that we don't have that visual, that can help them visually discriminate between buttons and have more success than using it. Another thing too that can be really helpful is color coding. So we can match all of the pronouns with the same colors, all of the action words with the same colors, the prepositions. And fortunately for a lot of the high-tech devices, in language systems, they already do that for you. So you don't have to go in and recreate it. And again, thinking of cortical visual impairment, utilizing those high contrast buttons, some AAC language systems already have that built in. And so that's something to consider as well, if your AP Hero has CVI or suspected CVI. You can also change the background color. So for any of those words that are hidden, if you want to turn all the background color black to make it pop more, that's an option. Maybe creating more spacing between words if they have any kind of fine motor challenges or vision challenges. You can also utilize the dwell or release time where they have to press and hold the button a little bit longer, and that can help if they have fine motor challenges, or if they're also just really fast communicators and just kind of slowing them down a little bit. And then other tools could be like a key guard or a touch guide, where essentially what those are is you put them on top of the device and then they have little holes, and that helps kind of if they want to trail along or press the buttons, and that can help with accuracy. All right, so any questions before we jump into trials? Cool. All right, so then for trials, we definitely always want to ensure that we have some sort of trial before we really dive into an AAC system. Although I understand that sometimes that's just not possible, especially if maybe you're getting a device from the Department of Education, or they already had one previously. But in an ideal world, we want to have a trial, and we want to provide sufficient time for the trial. And that can look different for each individual depending on their learning style, their learning pace, how quickly they engage with the AAC system. But when we have these trials, first we want to ensure that the AAC system is accessible to them in all settings, contexts, and across communication partners. And we really want to use it in highly motivating and fun activities. So if we were to take the AAC system and just introduce it and just use it when they're sitting at a table doing work, they're going to associate that with work, and we're going to potentially see some device abandonment and no desire to use it. So we really want to emphasize using it during their most preferred activities. And then we want to be modeling all the time. We're going to talk more about modeling in a little bit, but I can't stress this enough we need to be modeling so that they can then see how to use the device. And then we can also want to check in and continuously monitor and modify the AAC system based on their performance. So if we're seeing that they're just tapping very quickly all around, then maybe we do implement the dwell setting and it slows them down a little bit to do that. Or maybe we need to hide more buttons because it's a little too overwhelming for how many buttons are on there. So you can always check in and keep on modifying that. And then usually about halfway through the trial period, I like to meet as a team to answer any questions, provide observations, and share different thoughts and opinions. And I find this especially important because if the team doesn't have buy-in, then likely the child will also not, because then if the team's the one that's helping ensure that they have access to the AAC system, that they're modeling, and they're not doing any of that because they're not having the buy-in to the AAC system, then that can also then affect the communicator. So it's a whole approach, right? So along with that, for measuring success, we can also then look at the actual communicator and what they're doing. So while we often think of using the AAC system as successes when they touch the correct button, there are so many other ways that we can measure this. First, we can look and see, is a communicator orienting to the AAC system? Are they starting to develop, or do they understand a one-on-one correspondence that the AAC system has a direct correspondence with what they're trying to communicate? Do they attend to and maintain attention to the display when you're modeling or when they're using it? Do they remember the location of words? So this might be, potentially more challenging as they're learning something new, but some kids also latch on really quickly, where if they know the word Dora, their favorite word, is 2 hits away, and they learn that right away, that's a really good indicator that yes, they are able and capable to do that. Do they initiate the use of the AAC? Do they navigate between pictures and pages? And do they also utilize tools? That would be like the alphabet tool. You might even see them using Word Finder, where the Word Finder is a tool that often occurs in some high-tech language apps. And what you can do is you can type in a word if you're not sure where it is, and then it will lead you exactly to where that location is on the device. So I definitely recommend you using it as communication partners, but also sometimes we see our communicators using it as well right away. Okay, so that is the assessment part. Any questions so far regarding assessment? I know it's very brief and I'm talking very fast to try to get through all of this, but please feel free to ask any questions. Great. So next we're going to dive into partner augmented input. And while this might be a more novel term, it's a concept that we've really talked about quite a bit. So essentially, partner augmented input has a bunch of different names. We also call it natural aided language input, and aided modeling. And really what that is it's modeling language on a device, because our goal is that language exposure. So this occurs when the communication partner selects a word or an icon on the AAC and then interacts with the communicator verbally. So for example, if I were to press the word play, and then I might verbally expand and say, oh, let's go play. And that would be an example of partner augmented input. A big key part of this is when we model, we're doing so without any expectation on the communicator. So they do not need to follow the model. They don't need to press the button, because again, our goal is just language exposure. We're teaching them, this is a word that you could use, this is where it's located. And one of the reasons why this is so important is when we think about typical language and speech development, what often happens is we're using spoken language all the time, and we're using speech and we're talking with babies, and they start to hear it, they're inundated in it, and then slowly they start to babble, and then they start to use spoken output too, and spoken language. However, with those that might have use more multimodal education or have difficulties with spoken language, we're still modeling all that spoken language, but then now all of a sudden they have an AAC system and they have no idea what to do with that because they haven't been exposed to that. They haven't been shown that yet. So what we want to do is take that similar approach and be modeling on the AAC system, just like we do with our spoken speech. And then that will help facilitate that learning on the AAC system. So we're trying to kind of make that bridge happen so that they can better access it. And there are a few different types of partner augmented input. I like to break it out based on typical language development and play development. So we have one that is self-talk. And essentially what this is when we're modeling, we're talking about what we as a communication partners are doing. So these are going to be a lot of I statements like, oh, I'll go to the refrigerator and I press go. Parallel talk would be when we're talking about what the communicator is doing. This is very similar to what we talked about during our last roundtable, where we're observing what they're doing, we're attributing meaning, and then we're narrating what they're doing. Like, oh, you like to eat grapes, and then we're modeling like. We also have responsive labeling, which is when we would talk about the object the communicator is interacting with. So maybe the example would be the hamburger is hot, and I'm modeling the word hot on there. And then we have toy talk, which occurs when we're talking about the toy the communicator is acting with or interacting with. So like the blocks fell down, and we're modeling the word down. These are wonderful to think about, and I really encourage you to try each of these with your 8P heroes, whether it's using AAC or spoken language, but really just to start practicing that, because what tends to happen is we tend to jump in and do a lot of the parallel talk, or we tend to do a lot of telling them what to do. And I really find that using self-talk, responsive labeling, and toy talk can be especially helpful when we start to see the communicator maybe feel overwhelmed with the AAC system, or maybe there's some device abandonment going on. Because when we kind of remove them almost, or don't put the focus on them, and we put the focus on the toy they're engaging with or on ourselves, then that can help them re-engage and re-relate to what's going on. So just ideas to keep on practicing. And then for modeling tips, we also want to ensure that we are modeling even when the communicator isn't looking at you or the device. So just because they might not be looking directly at you doesn't mean that they're not attending. So often I'll see a kid who might be looking off to the side, and maybe then they lift up their ear, and that indicates to me that they are attending. It just might not be in the way that we typically consider attending to look like. We also want to ensure that we go slow. So we want to take our time while using the AAC system. This is a really beautiful thing because you're learning the AAC system, the communicator is learning the AAC system, and now you get to do it together. Frequently, especially if I'm new to a team or to an AAC language system, I might even say out loud of like, oh, I'm looking for the word go. and then wait for a second as I'm looking. And more often than not, then a kid will jump in and be like, oh, here it is, and like show me where go is. And that's such a wonderful opportunity because now they got to show that confidence and they got to be kind of the educator during that. So feel free to take those moments with them. And while it might feel like you're missing out on a communicative opportunity, there's other opportunities that then you can take with that. We also want to model words that match the communicator's expected language output. So we would start with single words. We don't need to model every single word. So instead of doing maybe like go play and combining those words, we might just start with go. Because if we start with go play, then that might be learned into a huge chunk where now every time the child's using go play to indicate go. So maybe we're saying like, oh, look, the train is going, and they say go play. So we wanted to start with one at a time and build upon that, just like we would with typical language development. Another one too, as I mentioned before, is utilizing that word finder to help search for target words. This can be great because you can make this into an interactive activity where you guys are both doing it, you and the communicator or the AP hero, and you're finding the word together, you're spelling the word out, and then you're incorporating maybe some literacy skills and some letter sound correspondence. And then another thing too that I always recommend is just starting off with maybe 2 or 3 words per activity, because it can feel so overwhelming when you have this whole device coming at you. But if you just choose 2 or 3 words for one activity and that's what you're focused on, and then slowly switch it up and change it up, that's not only helpful for you as the communication partner, but also for your AP hero. And I also recommend starting on the home page because that's where you're going to see a lot of those core words. It's also just way more efficient where you don't have to navigate through multiple folders. You can just go right there and go quickly. So with that in mind, here is an example of how we could incorporate partner augmented input and use 2 words to target. So for this activity, let's say the AP here I'm working with loves to go swinging. And I'm going to choose the target words ahead of time and decide I'm going to work on up and go. So for self-talk, I might say something like, I'm going to pull you up, up, up. And what I'm doing is I have the device right here where they can see it. And in this case, I might even model up 3 times just because it's fun and because it sounds great. And that's what we say too. So I might say, I'm going to pull you up, 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 and then pull up in a natural consequence. And I'm not putting any demand on her or him. Then we would go to parallel talk and you could say like, oh, look at you go. And now I'm modeling the word go. And then responsive labeling or toy talk, the swing is going so fast and I'm modeling go again. So that way we got go in 2 different ways. Or 2 different communicative contexts and in 2 different types of partner augmented input. So with this, I would love to have you guys practice as well. So let's say the activity is eating and our target words are going to be good, eat, because often those are on the home page. So in the chat, please feel free to jot down an idea of what you would use for self-talk. And these are going to be any of those I statements using good or eat. I'm going to, yeah, that's a great one. But a good start of I'm going to, and then maybe like eat.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just talk since clearly I hit
Perfect.
return too fast. I was just, for us, it would probably be bite rather than eat. And I think that's where I was getting hung up. But like, I'm going to give you a bite. Is that bite?
Yeah.
I have a hard time with the parallel talk with not making it a question, I guess. That bite is good.
Very tricky. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you just shift the inflection a bit like, ooh, that bite looks good.
Yeah.
And that's a really great point too. I love that you bring up bite because that is more than maybe of a family preference, right? Of a personal or more personal word that we might hear. But say bite might be now in the actions folder and a little bit harder to get to. You could use the word give instead because that might be on the homepage. So it's like lightly shifting that. But you could also use bite too. There's no like wrong one, but just for ease. So that's a great example.
We've always had bite and drink on there for the feeding times.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. And so that's also then personalized too to your 8P hero, which is exactly how that should be. And so a great example would be like, yeah, I'm going to give you a bite. I also used it as like a comment of, I like to eat bananas too, or I like to take bites of bananas, and changing that into maybe a personal comment, but then also you narrating your actions is really great too, because then they know what's expected and what's coming. So how about for a parallel talk? And again, feel free to unmute yourself as well if that's easier, or in the chat. I might move forward just for the sake of time, but Karen, I believe you mentioned that you were saying that you guys also tend to use parallel talk. And so one of these could be like, it looks like you want to eat more bananas. And that's something we practiced during our last one of commenting on what they're doing. And parallel talk is still a wonderful thing to implement. For responsive labeling for this one, because it is an item, I might say something like the banana looks good and then model the word good on there. So ideas to try out. It is kind of uncomfortable to start off with, but if you are like, I'm just going to do self-talk during this activity and just practice that, and the next time I'm just going to do responsive labeling, it becomes easier and easier as you move forward with it. So with partner augmented input, really just a quick highlight summary. Everyone should be modeling, everybody should be utilizing partner augmented input. We should do it all the time because communication happens all the time, and we should do it everywhere because communication happens everywhere. So now we talked about partner augmented input, which is the idea of language exposure without putting any kind of expectation on modeling, or modeling without any kind of expectation. Now we're going to talk about prompting. So the way I think of this is, say we're learning to ride a bike. You can watch somebody ride a bike all day long. They can tell you all about the handles. They can tell you how to steer and how to pedal. But until you actually do that, you're not going to learn how to ride a bike. So this is where the prompting comes in. And I really want to emphasize that when we're prompting, we want to ensure that we are always being respectful, that we're honoring what they want to communicate, and that we're just supporting them and assisting them. So this goal is for the language use. And this is where we help the AAC user or the 8P hero actively participate by providing an appropriate amount of support. We're also inviting them to communicate. We're not forcing them to communicate. So we're not saying, tell me this or say this. Rather, we're going to use more inviting language. Like, you can try this word, or we could say this. We also are going to follow the least to most prompt hierarchy to encourage initiation and independence and spontaneous use of the AAC system. So this is the prompt hierarchy. And we're going from least to most. So the least restrictive to the most restrictive. The least, as some of you may know, my most favorite prompt is expectant pause, where we are going to potentially tempt with an activity and then wait 5 to, I put 10, but honestly 30 seconds, and just give that expectant pause for them to initiate if they feel so inclined or if they are able to. Then we might use something like body language, where we might do an expectant facial expression or a shrug, just to let them know like, hey, it's your turn to communicate if you would like. Then we'll go into an indirect verbal prompt, which might be an open-ended question. So like, now what, or what should we do? Then we would go into a direct verbal prompt where we would ask for a specific response. And again, this is where I'm going in with that inviting language of, let's try the word play together. And now you're making it into a group activity, or you two are in this together, right? It's not just like putting this demand on them. Then we could go with a gesture prompt, where we're going to actually point to the symbol or maybe the device, whatever you feel like they're going to have the most success with. We could also have a visual model on the device, where then you're pressing the button and you're assisting them to do that. Or the most restrictive would be our physical assistance, which could be an elbow prompt that might look like this, a wrist prompt, or an underhand support. With that in mind, a strong word of caution with physical prompting. If you are going to use physical prompting, or anybody on your team, really ensure that you have a strong rationale for why you're doing this, and that you've tried everything else before going to physical prompting. And of course, consult your speech therapist, because what can happen is if we're starting to implement physical prompting, it increases a dependence on physical assistance. And it also can promote passive learning, where I've had children who will just reach out their hand and just wait for somebody to take it and then start to help them. And that can be really concerning because that starts to take away their communicational autonomy, where now they are not in control of what they're going to say. And it can also create opportunities for forced communication. So what I mean by that is, while we might be intentionally trying to help, it could be then we're making them say something that they don't want to say. And that implicitly starts to teach them that we have the right to touch them, to make them do what we want them to say, and take away that autonomy. So instead, what you can do is go back, check back in with motivation, because again, if they're not motivated to communicate in this activity, in this scenario, then let's reassess and do something different. Or if that effort is too high, then let's bring down that effort, right? Let's review the target word selection. Maybe it's not as meaningful for them at this time. So in the example of eat versus bite, eat might not be as meaningful because that's not used, but bite is. And so maybe then we need to look at the word bite instead for that target word. We want to assess access. Are they in the proper alignment? Are they able to access it? Is the device too dimmed where they can't see it? And we also want to ensure consistent modeling across teams. So how can we now put this all together? So we're going to talk about you incorporating partner augmented input and the prompt hierarchy. So taking the activity earlier of swinging, and I'm going to just choose one word for up right now, because while we're modeling two, now I'm going to focus in on one. So we're creating a situation where you are involved, you as a communication partner are involved in the activity. With swinging, great opportunity, especially if they have difficulty pushing themselves. For example, maybe you're holding them and we're doing that up. And we're going to model the target word 4 or 5 times. I'm going to vary what I'm saying. I'm going to use different types of partner augmented input. I'm going to say, oh, look, we're going up. And I'm pulling them up. It's so fun to go up. The swing is going up. And I'm modeling that up. And I'm holding the device in front of them when I'm modeling. So we come back down. I press up and say that. Then we have that natural consequence. Then on maybe that 5th or 6th time, I'm going to pause when we're back down, have the device ready, and I'm going to follow the prompt hierarchy. So now I'm going to pause because I've shown that, hey, this word up has this natural consequence. And I'm going to do expectant pause. I'm going to do it indirect, like a shrug. I might say, okay, now what? And then if it's still challenging, I might say like, hey, let's try the word up together. And we go in with a gesture prompt to press it together. And that's how we're going to then, once they have success pressing up, then we provide immediate reinforcement. If, for example, though, I bring it back down and I say go, or they say more or something else, amazing. We're going to honor that too. And I also might remodel up again of like, yeah, let's go up. And I'm going to expand on what they just said. Then we're going to just keep repeating that. We're going to go back to 2. We're going to go back to modeling without any expectation, because we don't want now, okay, you learned it. Now you have to say it every time, because that's not what we do when we communicate. We usually go back and forth, right? So now I'm going to go back to modeling a few times and then they'll go. So you kind of have to play around with, where is your AP hero at the time? How motivated are they? Is this a familiar word? And that'll help direct on how often you're modeling and what kind of prompts you're providing. And then if they start to use it independently, then maybe you introduce a second word of like go or stop or more or down, and you start to play around with that and you start to add more and more words and you follow that same steps. Okay. Any questions on the prompt hierarchy and partner augmented input and how we can utilize those together? Cool. So during the last roundtable, I had a question about stimming, which honestly comes up just all the time with almost every AAC user I've ever worked with. So let's talk a little bit about stimming. First, we'll define it. So stimming is self-stimulatory behavior, and we all do it. So for me, I'll tap my knee up and down when I'm waiting. Some people might crack their knuckles. Some people might tap a table. We all have different stimulatory behaviors. For AAC, what this can look like is repeating a button or activating a word or a phrase, so repeatedly pressing it. They also might repeat sound effects. So if I were to use like the word Montana, maybe they'd just do like mon, 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 and that's them stimming on it. For a copy of these slides, yeah, I can send those definitely. And then Sorry, I just got a question. Can we get a copy of these slides and I can send those? Navigating to a specific folder too. So they might just be keep on going to this folder over and over, and you might see stimming on that. Those are the main three things that we kind of see with stimming with the AAC system. I'm sure there are others too. But then when we think of, okay, what's the purpose of stimming? Why are they doing that? What's the cause behind it? It can really be broken into two main categories. So the first being self-regulation, right? When we're stimming, this helps us manage emotions such as anxiety, excitement, or frustration. So any of those high intense feelings, this can be a way to self-soothe. It also can help us process and manage any kind of sensory overload when we see or when we're navigating different complex environments. So if we're in a really loud setting, this might be a way to, again, self-soothe or self-regulate and bring back to a calmer state. It can also just bring joy, which is a wonderful thing too, because we all want joy for our AP heroes. And if this is bringing joy, then let's facilitate that and grow with that. Another aspect is communication. So again, thinking back to that typical language development and speech development, we see a lot of babbling oftentimes with kids. This is very similar. So maybe they're just exploring and repeating the words on here and they're learning about the device. They're engaged with it. That's our very first step of what we want. So we really want to encourage the exploration and repetition. We can even comment on what they're doing and label what they're doing too, of how fun it is to look through all of our different words together. They also might just be communicating specific and preferred vocabulary, which happens a lot too, where they're showing a motivation, an emotion, or a favorite concept. So going back to Dora, if they're repeatedly pressing Dora, that might be them just saying, hey, I really love Dora. I want to talk about Dora. This is so much fun. They also might communicate and learn language through echolalian scripting. So using a script to relay a feeling, a memory, or a message, or something that's really meaningful to them. So when we see stimming happening, first we want to always acknowledge it as functional. So there's a purpose behind it, right? And with that in mind, we also want to create very stimming friendly spaces. So we want to give them an environment where they feel comfortable to do that, because that's their way of regulating, that's their way of having control over a situation. And in a lot of cases, or in some cases, we might even want to try to engage with this stimming. So if we're looking back and say they're talking about a specific and preferred vocabulary word, this could be a great opportunity to engage with them stimming. And they're talking about Dora over and over and over, and you're like, oh, I love Dora too. Maybe even start pressing Dora, Dora, Dora over and over to get them excited and engaged with it. And they know they're not alone. And so we get to talk about it. We get to talk around it. We get to talk about what Dora was doing. We'll watch a video. But then on the other side, maybe they don't want to have you engage with it. Maybe this is their way of self-soothing, and Dora actually is their way of then self-regulating. So going back over here, this is helping them manage maybe an emotion of frustration, and they're pressing Dora, 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 and you might want to respect their boundaries and just let them self-soothe and have that moment to get back to that place. Another thing too is looking at different sensory activities. So if it's a tapping that they're really liking, then maybe we seek out the OT and they recommend getting drums or something where they can tap, and it's in a different way, functional activity. What we don't want to do is we don't want to assume that repeatedly tapping a button means that they're not ready for AAC. As I mentioned, it's just like learning language development and speech development. That's that exploration, that babbling. We also don't want to remove or hide a button. We don't want to turn down the volume on the AAC, and we don't want to turn off or remove the AAC. Because when we do that, essentially it's, if we think of somebody who uses spoken speech, just us putting our hands over their mouth and saying, you can't say that. And they have a right to that word. So instead, let's manage that in a way, or respond to that in a way that we would if somebody was stimming vocally or physically in a different way. We also don't want to interrupt or redirect abruptly. So we want to say like, oh, that we're not talking about that right now. We're like, move it away. You can acknowledge it, and then you can start to maybe engage in a different activity. Again, reusing that motivation. Maybe they're bored and that's how they're communicating that. And now you have the opportunity to model, oh, I see you're feeling bored. You can model the word bored and then engage in something different. I really like this quote because it says, stimming is not the problem, but dismissal is. And I think that's especially important because we always want to figure out what is the purpose behind the stimming, and different words can mean different things too. So, okay, Went a little bit over, but we still have some time if you guys would all like to ask some questions. I'm happy to stick around. I do have some resources that I can quickly send into the chat. And so this first one is a communication screener that I really like because it's a good resource if you're considering AAC for an AP hero. It just is a quick checklist on how they're communicating and if they would be a candidate for it. A second one is a rubric for evaluating language AAC systems. This is not how the individual or the communicator uses it, but it is, you know, is this a good language system? Is it robust? And does it have all the things we were talking about earlier? And then this last one is a vocabulary list that can really help when you're deciding, okay, what words should we add to the AAC system? But there are also many more online too, but these are just some of the ones I've used. Okay, I'm going to pause talking and see if anybody has any questions.